I would like to speak to you about the problem of evil. This is really a very ambitious project. And I would like to start by saying that what strikes me in the contemporary context is the fact that we have two seemingly divergent tendencies with respect to evil. On the one hand, there is a growing absolutization of evil in ideological, political, religious discourse. Evil is that which has to be reduced because it is absolutely contrary to that which I believe, I think, and defend. Besides this absolutization of evil, there is paradoxically a sort of relativization of evil, in the sense that many contemporaries consider that there is no more any objective principles or any objective criteria upon which the very notion of evil and good could be founded. So that evil would be reduced to socio-economic productions or perhaps constructs of one kind or another. So on the one hand, absolutization of evil on the ideological scene, so to speak. On the other hand, relativization of evil. I would like to suggest that mystical theology addresses both this absolutization of evil and this relativization of evil, and constitutes therefore the best possible answer to these two tendencies, to these two contemporary tendencies. So from the start, we have a distinction between two goods. We have the good as good, God as good, the ultimate good, the sovereign good, which is in fact beyond any polarity, beyond any duality. And then we have the polarity, the duality, good and evil. And Simon Weil suggests that the two goods are not the same. So the term good itself can be understood on different levels of reality, and dependent on which level it is considered, it may be deemed to entertain a very different relationship with evil. And indeed, it introduces us to a very different understanding of evil itself. My starting point is that traditional wisdom traditions place pure consciousness, absolute consciousness, at the origin and at the center, or at the top, which perhaps is the same, of their vision of reality. And they identify the supreme value or the supreme good with this consciousness. Henceforth, the relationship between human consciousness and this supreme absolute consciousness is the most determining factor in human experience, since it is both foundational, it is the foundation of our being, and it is final, it is the ultimate destiny of our being as well. By contrast, for typically modern thinkers, whose vision is informed by the post-medieval scientific outlook, it is physical reality that comes first. And consciousness, in all of its forms, is but an epiphenomenon, albeit sophisticated epiphenomenon, of the former, that is, of the material physical reality. Whereas wisdom traditions assert the primacy of consciousness, and indeed absolute consciousness, and its identification with being, consciousness is being. Such assertion lies at the core of any consideration of the world and informs the understanding of its relationship with its source. In this respect, the so-called mystical theologies tend to favor an account of relativity, or other than the supreme, that approaches the latter as a modification or a determination or a fragmentation of the supreme reality. In other words, we have the supreme, we have the ultimate, and then we have other than the ultimate or other than the supreme. And other than the supreme or other than the ultimate is necessarily relative to the ultimate. And in that sense, relativity or other than the ultimate is nothing but a kind of modification, determination, fragmentation of that ultimate. Whereas exoteric theological perspectives tend to emphasize the ontological, metaphysical gap that stands between the supreme and the created order, or the manifested order, for example, as in the Christian concept of creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. So there's a gap between God and his creation, so to speak. A seemingly absolute gap, if you wish. By contrast, mystical and philosophical outlooks teach, or at least suggest, an essential and universal non-duality that profoundly affects their apprehension of the world. In other words, they refuse to introduce an absolute chasm between the ultimate and the non-ultimate. This non-duality, or this unity, or this continuity, is often hastily identified with pantheism. This is pantheistic. Non-duality is pantheistic. Pantheism, as you know, is a philosophical position that was mostly highlighted in the West by Spinoza with his formula Deus sive natura, God or nature, which means God is nature and nature is God. Now, all of the teachings, the mystical teachings I'm going to speak about, recognize some form of immanence or presence of the divine within creation, but they also point, and that's very important to emphasize it, to a transcendence of the principle in relation to the manifestation. Therefore, they are not pantheistic. There is more to God than nature, in other words. And it could also be said that non-duality or essential unity in the mystical sense of the term is never totally exclusive, therefore, of some duality or some multiplicity on some levels of reality. And therefore, it is in no way equivalent to the night in which all cows are black, to use Hegel's expression. It is not the night of indifferentiation. Non-duality is not exclusive of a recognition of differentiations, differences, fragmentations on some levels, some lower levels of reality. It is not the black night in which all cows are black. So what I'm going to try to do here, it's a kind of, it's a bit ambitious within 1 hour or less, is to sketch the outlines of the apparent paradox of positing, on the one hand, the ultimate reality of the good, and on the other hand, a domain of relativity that is other than the good, and still proceeds from the good. There seems to be a contradiction here. And I would like to show that, in fact, it is not a contradiction. At least it is perhaps a contradiction on some rational level. But on the mystical level, there is no contradiction. There is a coincidence of the opposites, so to speak. And I will try to show this by sketching the outlines of this mystery within 3 mystical traditions. The Sufi Wahdat al-Wujud of Ibn Arabi, the Jewish Kabbalah, or some teachings from the Jewish Kabbalah, and finally the tradition of Kashmiri Shaivism. For Ibn Arabi, to start with him, creatures can be considered, any creature can be considered on 2 different levels of reality. That is, on the one hand, as immutable essences in God, in the divine. Everything is an immutable essence in God. And secondly, as an existential manifestation in creation. Everything that exists is, first of all, a possible permanent reality or entity, ayn thabita, in God's knowledge. And as such, it is non-existent in creation. The permanence of the essence partakes in God's eternity and its possibility will pertain to God's knowledge of it. But of course, permanent entities also exist in creation as existentiated entities. When God says kun, fayakun, they become existentiated entities. Entities, for in Arabic, are therefore good inasmuch as they are brought to existence by the good, that is God. Because the good entails no evil. But on the other hand, entities are or may be evil to the extent that they taste of non-existence as merely possible and not necessary realities. That is why in Arabic can paradoxically describe existentiation or creation as a passage from evil to good. In other words, manifestation is a passage from evil to good,